I have spent 40 years proving that the body is a lie the cold eventually corrects. That is not how we phrase it in the doctrine papers. In the papers, we write about thermal thresholds and metabolic ceilings, about the point past which no organism of our size and chemistry can hold its interior against the outside. We have a word for that point. On Tal Viharis, where the Caresi Institute sits half buried in the ice like a tooth in an old jaw, we called it the correction. Below the correction, flesh stops being an asset and becomes a schedule. A countdown written in the language of falling temperature. Every survival doctrine the Ilmaran Concord has ever ratified rests on one plain sentence, and I taught it to 3 generations of researchers. In true cold, you do not survive because of your body. You survive in spite of it, inside something you have built. I believed that sentence the way I believed the floor would be there when I put my foot down. It was not a theory to me. It was the ground. Then the board sent me a human, and a field report I could not make agree with the world, and told me to find the error. They were certain it was an error. So was I. That is the part I keep returning to. In the long unlit hours the ice gives you here the certainty. We were not fools. We were the most careful people the Concord had, and we were completely sure, and we were wrong in a way that has changed what I am able to sleep through. The report came from Survey Team 9. 3 of ours, dropped onto the northern shelf of this same world to map a fracture field, caught out when a pressure collapse took their transit shelter and both backup heaters in the same hour. Standard doctrine gives an unsheltered Ilmaran on that shelf in that season, somewhere between 40 and 90 minutes before the correction begins. It is not a cruel number. It is only a true one. We have measured it more times than I will admit in a written document. Team 9 was found alive after 19 hours. Not injured alive. Not barely alive, the way you sometimes recover a body with a flicker still in it that you cannot honorably call living. Alive. Coherent. Cold to the edge of their reserves but climbing back the moment they were warmed, no tissue lost, no correction begun. 19 hours on the open shelf with no shelter and no heat source of their own. Except that the recovery log said they had not been without a heat source. It said there had been a 4th body on that shelf. A human, from the survey contract's technical annex, a specialist named Ada Winter who had been mapping the same fracture field on a separate track and reached them when their beacon went dark. The log said she had kept them alive. The log did not say how because the 3 surveyors did not entirely know how. What they knew was that she had gathered them and put her body against them and told them to stop moving and to breathe slowly, and that through the whole polar night she had stayed warm. Not warm as in comfortable, warm as in a source. They described it the way you would describe a fire you could not see, a steadiness at their backs that did not fade as the hours went. That was still there when the sky finally grayed, and the recovery skiff came in low over the ice. I read that report 4 times. Then I flagged it as instrument corruption and recommended the team's core readings be re-examined for sensor fault, because bodies do not do that. Ours do not, and the human is smaller than we are and carries less mass and wears less against the cold, and every honest scale I know says she should have gone into the correction first, hours before them, and left 3 frozen colleagues to be recovered beside her. The board read my recommendation and overruled it. They had already ordered Winter brought to the Institute. Study her, they said, and give us the mechanism, because Survey Team 9 walked and we would like to understand why. That is how a human came to stand in my testing hall on a morning, when the outside temperature had settled into the range where we no longer send anyone out without a rated suit, and looked at the equipment I had spent my career building, and did not seem to grasp that she was the thing being questioned. I want to describe her plainly, because the plainness is the whole matter. She was not large. She came a little past my mid-chest, and the Ilmaran are not a tall people. She was soft in the way all humans are soft, no plating, no dense outer hide, no insulating quills, none of the honest cold world architecture you learn to respect on other species. Skin, thin and bare across the face and hands, the rest wrapped in ordinary layered cloth she could have taken off in the corridor without injuring herself. She had a way of standing that gave nothing, not hostility, not fear, a kind of settled patience, as if she had been waiting in rooms her whole life and had learned there was no profit in minding it. My second researcher, Tial, met her at the transfer lock and came to me pale under the ridges. She sweats, Tial said, as though reporting a wound. I understood the alarm. To us it is grotesque, the human habit of leaking their own water through the skin. In our physiology, breaching the thermal envelope is how you die. Water on the outside of the body in the cold is a countdown made visible. That a creature would do it deliberately, would open itself to the outside on purpose, struck every instinct we have as the behavior of something already dying and too simple to know it. She sweats in the corridor, Tial said, and she does not shiver in the hall, and I put my hand near her and doctor, she is warm. Standing still, doing nothing, she is warm, like a running heater with no housing. They run hot, I said. It's in the annex, high baseline output, it doesn't change the math. Doesn't it? Tial said, and did not make it a question and went to prepare the chamber. I told myself the doctrine held. I want that recorded honestly. I stood in my own hall, with the field report in my hand and my best researcher unnerved in front of me, and I chose the doctrine over both, because the doctrine had never been wrong in 40 years, and a soft sweating animal in a corridor was not going to be the thing that broke it. We put her in the chamber. The cold survival chamber at Caressy is the finest instrument of its kind in the Concord. It is a sealed hall within the hall, walled in layered cryoglass, threaded with heat-imaging arrays that read a body's interior temperature in real time, and painted across the observation screens in a scale of color deep warmth in the pale bands, the correction in the blues and the killing blacks. We can watch, live, the exact moment a body begins to lose the argument with the outside. I have watched it happen to test fauna 100 times. I have watched the pale core shrink inward as the blue climbs the limbs, and I have marked the timestamp. And I have written the number in the doctrine. We set the chamber to a controlled descent. Not the full killing cold, we are researchers, not butchers, and she had come to us alive and would leave the same way if I had any say in it. We set it to the working cold of the northern shelf, the environment that gives an Ilmaran 40 to 90 minutes. We seated her on the bench inside, in her ordinary cloth, no rated suit, no heater, at her own consent, which she gave with a small nod as if we had offered her a chair. "How long do you need me to sit here?" she asked, through the chamber's audio link. Her voice came calm and a little rough. "Until the readings settle," I said, "or until you tell us to stop. You will tell us to stop before it does you harm." "All right," she said, and folded her bare hands in her lap and waited. The temperature came down. On the screens her body glowed in the imaging array, a bright, generous spread of warmth, warmer than I expected even knowing their baseline, a whole standing furnace of a creature radiating into the falling air. Tial logged the ambient. The team went quiet. We watched the way you watch a stone you have thrown, waiting for it to begin its fall. I want to tell you what we expected, so you understand what we saw. We expected the shell to cool first, the skin, the hands, the face, the exposed periphery going blue as the body pulled its warmth inward to defend the core. That is correct behavior. That is what a body should do, and it is the beginning of the end, because the core cannot hold forever once it starts spending itself that way. We expected to watch her periphery darken, and the pale core shrink, and the correction begin, sometime inside the doctrinal window, at which point I would end the trial and we would have our timestamp and the field report would be filed as the anomaly it had to be. The shell cooled. Her hands went blue on the imaging and her face, exactly as a body should do. Tial marked it and glanced at me, and I nodded, because so far it was only the world behaving. And then it stopped. Not the cooling of the room kept falling. The retreat of her warmth stopped. The core, the bright deep center of her, held. It did not shrink inward the way every core I have ever imaged shrinks. It sat at the center of the screen, pale and steady, a furnace that had banked its heat to the middle, and then simply refused to spend it any faster than it made it. The periphery stayed blue and cold, and the core stayed bright, and the boundary between them held like a wall. Tial said, "The core's not moving." "Give it time," I said. We gave it time. We gave it the full doctrinal window and then half again as much. The room fell to the working cold of the shelf and held there, hour on the counter, and Ada Winter sat on the bench with her blue hands folded and her bright core steady and did not shiver, did not fail, did not begin the correction. On the screen she looked like something that had been built to do exactly this. A body that had decided, at some level beneath deciding, that the interior was not negotiable, and was prepared to feed it out of its own substance for as long as the substance lasted. "She's burning to hold it," Tial said quietly. He had pulled her metabolic trace and it was climbing. Her body was spending reserve at a rate that would have alarmed me in any patient, generating the heat it was radiating, paying for that steady core in fuel. "She's running herself like an engine. That's the mechanism. She's not insulated. She's not resisting the cold. She's outproducing it." I heard him. I understood the words. And still I could not make the doctrine let go of me, so I did the thing I am least proud of in a career I had thought was clean. I leaned to the audio link and I said, "Winter, tell me when you feel it start to slip." There was a pause. When she answered, her voice had roughened further, but it was level. "It's not going to slip, doctor," she said. "This is just cold. I've been colder." "Everyone slips," I said. "There is a point past which the body cannot hold. We measure it. It is the most reliable number we have." "Maybe for you," she said, not unkind, just correcting a fact she assumed I would want corrected. "For me it just gets expensive. I get hungry, I get tired, my hands hurt, but the middle stays lit as long as I've got anything to burn and I had a big meal so." A small movement of the blue hands, a shrug rendered in cold light. "I can sit here a while." Behind me the hall had gone entirely still, and I understood in that stillness that my team had stopped watching the human. They were watching me. They were watching the doctrine's author stand in front of the doctrine's grave. I ended the trial. I brought the chamber back up to a survivable warmth and opened the seal, and Tial went in with a thermal wrap she did not especially seem to need. And she thanked him and rubbed her sore blue hands together and winced and was, in every way that mattered, fine. We had our mechanism. It was not a mechanism I had a place for. Understand what our doctrine is built on. We are a cold world people who long ago decided that flesh was the weak link and engineering was the answer. Everything we know about survival is the story of getting the body inside something, a suit, a shelter, a heated hull, because the body itself was the thing that failed. Our whole relationship with the cold is a relationship of retreat and fortification. We do not stand in it. We hide from it in structures, and we are very good at building the structures, and the structures are the reason we are alive on 12 frozen worlds. And here was a soft, bare, sweating animal who did not build a structure and did not retreat, who simply stood in the cold and burned herself to hold a core the cold could not reach, and who found the whole thing so unremarkable that she was more concerned about her sore hands than about the number I had spent 40 years proving. That was the first thing that broke in me. It was not the last. Because I still had the field report, and now I could not file it as an error. I went back to survey Team 9's recovery log with new eyes, and I understood, finally, what had happened on the northern shelf. 3 of my people, unsheltered, dropping toward the correction on the doctrinal schedule, and a human arriving with a body that did not merely survive the cold but produced surplus heat beyond what her own core required, heat spilling constantly off her skin into the air the way we had watched it spill in the chamber. Waste heat to her physiology. To 3 freezing Ilmaran, it was the difference between the recovery skiff finding survivors and the recovery skiff finding a grid reference. She had not warmed them with a device. She had warmed them with herself. She had put her radiating body against theirs and become the shelter, not a shelter she carried, not a shelter she built, the shelter. A warm-walled space made of one animal's living substance, and she had held it open around them for 19 hours by burning her own reserves down to nothing. And when the skiff came, she had been the coldest of the four, because she had spent everything she had keeping the others above the line. That is in the medical log, too. When they recovered the team, Winter's own core was lower than any of the surveyors. She had run herself nearly into her own correction to hold 3 strangers out of theirs, and she had not mentioned it because to her, as near as I can reconstruct, it had not seemed like a decision worth mentioning. Somebody was cold. She was warm. She was structurally a source of warmth, and there were cold people, and the rest followed. I brought this to the board myself. I did not delegate it. I had signed the recommendation calling their report an error, and I would be the one to stand in the doctrine hall and unsign it. The Survival Doctrine Board sits in a chamber cut deep into the Institute's foundation, below the ice line, where the temperature is stable and the old doctrine plaques line the walls. Every ratified principle of Ilmaran cold survival, carved and hung, the accumulated certainty of a people who beat the cold by never trusting flesh. I have addressed that board perhaps 200 times. I know the acoustics. I know how a confident report sounds in that room and how a weak one does. I brought Ada Winter with me. I thought they should see her. I thought the thing I was about to tell them should be standing in the room while I said it. I laid it out cleanly. The chamber trial, the held core, the metabolic trace, the surplus radiation. Then the field report, now unfillable, 3 surveyors alive at 19 hours because a human body is not merely cold-tolerant but cold-generative. A self-heating engine that produces more warmth than it needs and cannot help but shed the excess, so that any cold thing pressed against it is warmed whether the human intends it or not. I told them what it meant for the doctrine. That the sentence I had taught for 40 years, in true cold you survive inside something you build, had a species-shaped hole in it. That there exists an animal for whom the body is not the weak link but the shelter itself. That we had built our entire relationship with the cold around fleeing into structures, and here was a creature that walked into the cold and became one. The board is not an emotional body. They did not gasp. That is not what dread looks like in an old and careful people. What happened was quieter and worse. They went still, all of them, the way the hall had gone still around the chamber, and I watched the understanding move across the room like the cold moving up a limb. Elder Vosk, who has sat on that board longer than I have held my post, was the one who spoke. She did not look at me. She looked at Winter, who stood beside me in her ordinary cloth with her healed hands folded, patient as furniture. "Human," Vosk said, "the 3 you warmed on the shelf, were they known to you?" "No," Winter said. "You reached them across open ice, in a killing environment at risk to your own life, for 3 strangers." Winter considered this the way you consider a question that has been made more complicated than it is. "They were cold," she said. "I wasn't much, I had it to spare." A small pause. "You'd do the same, wouldn't you, if you had it to spare and someone didn't?" And that was the sentence that finished it. Not the trial, not the metabolic trace. That sentence, offered so plainly, in a room full of a people whose entire civilization was an admission that we do not have it to spare, that in the cold we have only exactly enough for ourselves and must build walls to keep even that. She stood in front of the accumulated doctrine of a people who survive by fortifying and asked us, without any edge in it at all, whether we would share our warmth with a stranger. And every plaque on that wall was an answer of no, not out of cruelty, out of arithmetic. We have never had it to spare. We built the walls because we had to. Vosk was quiet for a long moment. Then she said the thing I have not been able to put down since. "We spent 900 years learning to hide from the cold," she said. "We taught ourselves that flesh was the enemy, that the body was the thing the cold corrected, and the only survival was the structure you could put between yourself and the dark." She looked at the human. "And they have a soft animal that walks into the dark and holds it off with nothing but the fire it carries. That gives its surplus to the freezing without being asked, because it does not occur to it to do otherwise. We armored ourselves against the cold. They befriended it. They are the warm thing the cold cannot finish. She turned at last to me. Strike the sentence, Orith, she said. Rewrite the doctrine, note the exception, note it in full. A pause, and something in the old face I do not have a clean word for, not fear exactly, but its close, careful cousin. And note this also, if we ever find ourselves across a line from these creatures in a true cold, in a real dark, we had better hope we are the ones they have it to spare for. I have rewritten the doctrine. The sentence I taught for 40 years is gone from it. In its place is a longer, more honest passage, and at the end of the passage there is a line I argued for and the board approved, and it is the truest thing I have ever put into a doctrine paper. There is a body in the galaxy that does not survive the cold. It outlasts it. It carries its own fire, spends that fire freely, and keeps warm whatever it chooses to hold. We build shelters against the dark. The human is one. Winter went home on the next survey rotation. She thanked us for the meals. She ate an astonishing amount during her stay, and now I understand why. And I make sure any human who comes to Caresi is fed without limit, because a fed human is a warm one, and a warm one is a thing I would rather have with me than any structure I have ever built. She did not seem to think she had done anything worth the study. When I told her at the transfer lock that she had corrected 40 years of my life's work, she gave me the small settled look she gave the chamber, and the corridor, and the cold, and said, "It's just how bodies work, doctor. Yours keeps you alive. Mine keeps me alive, and then some. The then some has to go somewhere." Then she went out through the lock, into the working cold of the shelf, in her ordinary cloth, with no rated suit, because she did not need one for the short walk to the skiff, and I watched her on the imaging array as she went, a bright, generous, walking furnace of a creature shedding warmth into the killing air of my world as if it were nothing, as if it cost her nothing, as if the cold that has defined my entire people were only weather. The core held the whole way to the skiff. It always would. I have the trace. I keep it on the wall now beside the old struck plaque where the young researchers can see both, the number I was so sure of and the pale, steady center that did not obey it. I tell them the same thing every intake now. It is the only doctrine I fully trust anymore. Build your shelters. Build them well. But know that somewhere out in the dark there is a soft, warm animal that is its own shelter, that will walk into the cold that would correct you and hold it off with nothing but the fire it carries, and will pull you inside that fire without being asked, and think nothing of it at all. Pray it has it to spare for you. It very nearly always will. That is the part that should frighten you most.